Kingdom, the Baharuth Empire, and the Slain Theocracy. These names did not appear in the context of Yggdrasil, which was inspired by Norse mythology. Ains felt like the world was spinning and his body was wobbling. Ains gripped the table edge with a gauntlet hand to maintain his balance. Although he had expected this world to be an alien one, he could not help but be surprised by it. The impact was greater than he had expected. This was the first time he had felt so shaken ever since he had become undead. Ains tried his best to remain calm, and reconsidered what he had heard about those neighboring kingdoms, and the local geography. Firstly, there was the Riestai's kingdom, and the Baharuth Empire. These countries were on different sides of a mountain range, and to the south of those mountains was a sprawling forest, and at the edge of that forest was this village, under the Riestai's kingdom, and the fortress city of Irantal. Relations between the kingdom and the empire were bad, and they would fight a battle in the wilderness near Irantal almost every year. To the south was the Slain Theocracy. The best way to describe the orientation of these countries was to draw a circle, and then divide it up with an inverted T. It seemed confusing, but it was much easier to describe things that way. To the left was the Riestai's kingdom, to the right was the Baharuth Empire, and below them was the Slain Theocracy. There were other countries, but the chief only knew of these three. The chief was not sure where exactly this village was placed between the three of them. In other words, how foolish of me. The knights from just now were wearing armor emblazoned with the insignia of the Baharuth Empire, so the chief believed that they were from the Baharuth Empire. But this area also bordered the Slain Theocracy, so they might have been knights from that country in disguise. Releasing them all was a mistake. He should have kept one for questioning, but it was too late for that now. If this was the work of the Slain Theocracy, then he should probably do something on the Empire's side. On the kingdom's side, he should have accumulated enough goodwill with them for rescuing their village, so things should be fine for now. Ains sank into thought. Was he the only one who had come to this world? Impossible. There was a very high chance other players had come here too. Perhaps Harahiro-san was here as well. He needed to think about what would happen if he encountered other players. If other players had come to this world, they would probably gather up, given the nature of Japanese people. When the time came, he had to do almost anything to blend in. He could give in to anything as long as it did not involve Ains Ulgaun. The problem was what would happen if the other side considered him an obstacle. The possibility was slight, but it could not be discounted. Ains Ulgaun was a guild that had always roleplayed as villains through piking, and thus they were a much-hated guild. He could not be sure that he had shed that negative image. For all he knew, the other players might want to take revenge on him out of a sense of justice and righteous anger. In order to avoid others declaring a vendetta on him, he had to refrain from doing anything that antagonized the surrounding people. For instance, massacring the local populace, especially innocent civilians, might enrage those players who had not yet lost their humanity. Of course, it would be a different matter if there was a reason which would satisfy them, such as killing the knights who were trying to sack this village. In any event, it would be better if future actions were taken for a high-sounding reason. That also meant he might have to do things he did not like, but that could not be helped. If the people he met bore hatred toward Ains Ulgaun, then combat would be unavoidable. To that end, he had to draw up a plan and countermeasures if that situation took place. Given the current strength of the great underground tomb of Nazarik's defenses, they could easily overwhelm about 30 level 100 players. In addition, they could use world-class items in their defense, so it was a nigh-impregnable fortress. They would probably be able to repel invaders like they had in the past. However, it was easy to see how dire the situation could be without reinforcements. In addition, the trump card of Ains Ulgaun, their world-class items, would drain Ains' levels every time he unleashed their full power. If they were attacked in succession, the time might come when the world-class items would become unusable. Ains was very clear that wargaming a scenario like this in his head was prone to bias and tunnel vision. However, Ains was no longer a child, and he always considered the worst-case scenario before taking any action. This was simply thinking of how to take care of a problem before it happened. If he just wanted to scrape by, he could simply live in the mountains like a beast. However, the power he possessed and the mighty name he bore prevented him from doing that. If he wanted to coexist peacefully with the world, then he would need to deal with problems as and when they came up. As such, combat and the expansion of fighting power would become a very important topic in future. He had to gather information about this world, as well as news about other players. That should do. What happened? No, it's nothing. I simply spaced out because things were not as I expected. Right, can you tell me about something else now? Yes, I understand. The village chief started talking about monsters next. Much like Yggdrasil, this world had monsters in it. The nearby forest was filled with monsters, and one of them was known as the wise king of the forest. There were also dwarves, all sorts of elves, goblins, orcs, ogres, and the like. Apparently some of the demi-humans had even built their own nation. There were people called adventurers who drove off these monsters, and they counted many magic casters among their number. Apparently, these adventurers had guilds of their own in all the big cities. Apart from that, he also learned about the nearby fortress city of Irantal. According to the chief, Irantal was the biggest city in the area, although he did not know exactly how large its population was. That seemed to be the best place to gather information. While the chief's words were helpful, there were still many unclear details. Therefore, it would be better to send someone over there to find out, rather than ask the chief questions. Finally, there was the matter of language. It was truly surprising that they understood Japanese in this new world. As a result, Ains looked carefully at the village chief's mouth, and discovered that he was not, in fact, speaking Japanese. Neither their words of the movements of their mouths matched up with the Japanese language. After that, he did some more experiments. His conclusion was that someone had fed the people of this world some sort of translation konyaku. However, he did not know who had fed that substance to them. The language of this world was translated before the other party heard it. If he could understand what the other person said, then he should be able to communicate with non-human life forms, like say, a dog or a cat. The question now was who had done this. In addition, the village chief did not find this strange. It seemed perfectly natural to him. In other words, this was a basic principle of the world. Then again, when one thought about it calmly, this was a magical world, which might run on completely different precepts than the world in which Ains had been born. It would seem that the basic knowledge and facts he had learned in his previous life were no longer applicable here. This was a grave problem. If he was ignorant about this world, there was a chance he might make a fatal mistake. Ignorance was synonymous with disaster, in this case. Right now, Ains lacked information about his surroundings. He had to solve this problem quickly, but he had no idea where to begin. Could it be that he had to kidnap someone and make him talk about what he knew? That was not a very workable option. That being the case, there was only one alternative left to him. It would seem I will need to live in a city for a while. He had to observe and imitate many things in order to learn about the world. He also needed to understand the magic of this world, and many other things about it. As he thought about this, he heard footsteps from outside the flimsy wooden door. There was a large delay between the sounds of the footsteps, which meant that whoever it was, they were not advancing quickly. Those were the steady, plodding sounds of a grown man's footsteps. A knocking came from the door just as Ains turned to it. The chief could not help but look at Ains' face. He dared not act of his own accord, because he was still explaining things to his savior, as payment for saving him and everyone else in the village. Please, by all means. I was intending to take a break myself. I won't mind if you step outside. I'm very sorry about this, the chief said as he nodded in apology. He headed to the door, and when he opened it, a villager appeared. He looked first to the chief, then to Ains, and said, "Chief, I'm sorry to interrupt you when you're talking to our guests, but they're ready for the burial." Oh. The chief looked to Ains, his eyes begging for his approval. "It's fine. There's no need to worry about me. Thank you. Then, tell the others that I will be there soon. Part 2. The burial ceremony was held in a nearby communal graveyard. It was surrounded by a broken-down fence, and within were several circular stone slabs inscribed with people's names. The village chief recited the verses to ease the spirits of the dead, and the words from his mouth appealed to a god that Ains had never heard of in Yggdrasil. It was a prayer that the spirits of the dead would find peace. It appeared that there were not enough hands to bury all the bodies at once, so they chose to bury some of them first. To Ains, burying the dead on the day they died was too hasty, but perhaps this was a normal practice for the faiths in this world. He spotted the sisters he saved among the other villagers, Enri Emmet and Ninu Emmet. Their parents' bodies were among those that would be buried today. As he watched the villagers from close by, he idly stroked a 30-centimeter-long wand under his robe. The wand was made of ivory and capped with gold. There were runes over the grip, and it radiated an aura of holiness. It was a wand of resurrection. It was a magic item which could return the dead to life. Of course, Ains did not possess just one of these wands. He had enough to resurrect all the dead in the village, with room to spare. According to the village chief, this world's magic did not have the power to raise the dead. That being the case, if he used the wand of resurrection, he would create a miracle in this village. However, after the prayer finished, as the burial ceremony neared its end, Ains returned the wand to his inventory. He could have brought them back to life, but he chose not to. This was not because he felt that the souls of the dead were the domain of the gods, or some other religious reason. It was simply because he felt that there were no benefits in doing so. It was not hard to tell which would be more threatening, a magic caster that could take lives, or a magic caster which could return them. In addition, the chances of the villagers keeping the secret would be very low, even if he ordered them not to talk about the resurrections. The power to conquer death was something that everyone craved. If things were different, he might have used that power to recall people to life. However, he did not have enough information on the local conditions, so it would be unwise to do so now. They should be content with the fact that the village was saved, Ains muttered as he looked at the Death Knight that was standing behind him. The Death Knight was another mystery. In Yggdrasil, all summoned monsters would vanish after a certain time unless special methods were used in their summoning. He had not used any such methods to summon the Death Knight, and its summoning time was long past, but it remained here. Although he had many hypotheses for this phenomenon, he still did not know enough to come to an answer. As Ains was thinking about this, a pair of figures turned up beside him. One was albedo, and the other was roughly humanoid, but resembled a spider dressed in a ninja uniform. Its 8 legs were tipped with sharp blades. An 8-edge assassin? Albedo, this is. Ains looked around, but it seemed like none of the villagers were paying attention here. Albedo was one thing, but bringing a monster here would make them the center of attraction, even if the burial was going on. Just then, Ains remembered that 8-edge assassins were monsters that could go invisible. I brought him over because he wanted to pay his respects to you, Ains-sama. Oh, how refreshed my soul is whenever I see Ains essay. Enough of that. Are you part of the support troops? Yes. There are 400 vassals beside myself who stand ready to assault the village at any time. Assault? How had it ended up like this? As Ains pondered that problem, he began muttering to himself, Sabas had no talent for passing messages. There's no need for an assault, the problem's already been taken care of. Who's your commander? That would be Ora-sama and Mare-sama. Demiurge-sama and Shaltir-sama remain in Nazarick on alert, while Cocytus-sama is supervising Nazarick's perimeter security. I see, well, too many cooks spoil the broth. Everyone but Ora and Mare are to fall back. How many of you 8-edge assassins are there? There are 15 of us in total. Then you can stay with Ora and Mare. After watching the 8-edge assassin nod in acknowledgement, Ains turned his eyes back to the burial. They were about to fill in the graves, and the 2 girls were crying non-stop. Diamond suit, diamond suit, diamond suit. In order not to interrupt the burial, Ains strolled leisurely toward one of the roads leading to the village. Behind him were Albedo and the Death Knight. Though his information gathering had been interrupted by the funeral, Ains had still managed to learn much about the region and the ways of this world. By the time he left the village chief's home, the sun was going down. It would seem his little hero act, to pay forward the kindness his old friend showed him, had taken more time than expected. Still, the time spent here had not been wasted. In particular, the more he learned about this world, the more he realized he did not know. It was enough that he was aware of his ignorance. As Ains watched the magnificent sunset, he thought about what he needed to do. It was dangerous to move around in this world when he did not understand anything about it. Ideally, he should finish gathering information and then begin acting in this world under a false identity. Although, after saving this village, hiding his identity was impossible. Even if the knights were exterminated, their parent country would unearth the truth. Much like in the previous world where forensic science was well developed, this new world might have its own ways of finding out the truth, and they might be very efficient in doing so. Also, even if they made no investigation, as long as the villagers survived, someone would eventually follow the trail back to Ains. To prevent a leak, he could take them all into the great underground tomb of Nazarick. However, the country that these villagers belonged to would not take that lying down, and they might even treat it as a kidnapping. Therefore, he had stated his name, and let the knights flee. There were two reasons for that. The first reason was that news about Ains would get around as long as he did not hole up in Nazarick. Therefore, it would be better if he controlled how the information got out. The second was because he wanted to spread the word that Ains Ulgaun saved a village and slew the knights. In particular, he wanted to let any players from Yggdrasil hear about it. Ains planned to take up residence in either the kingdom, the empire, or the theocracy. If there were other players in these countries, there should be some trace of them. In contrast, if Ains used Nazarick's personnel to gather this information, it would not only be troublesome, but very risky. For instance, given Albedo's personality, giving her the wrong kind of orders would end up making him unnecessary enemies. Therefore, from an information-gathering point of view, joining one of the countries was a very good idea. It would also be good to have one of them as backing in order to ensure the autonomy of Nazarick. After all, he could not take these countries lightly while he was not aware of their power. In addition, he could not lower his guard as long as he did not know who was the most powerful person in this new world. For all Ains knew, there might be someone stronger than him among these three nations. While there were a lot of drawbacks to becoming part of one of these kingdoms, there were many advantages as well. The question was the capacity in which he would join one of these countries. He was not interested in being a slave. Neither was he interested in becoming part of a black-hearted enterprise, like the one Harahiro-san was in. Therefore, he needed to make his existence known to these factions. After having a closer look at their respective situations, and how they treated him, he would move toward the most ideal of the factions. These were the basics of job hopping. In that case, when should he make his move? He might end up exposing his weaknesses, while he remained ignorant. Ains shook his head as he thought about that, as though he were tired. After all, he had been ceaselessly using his mind for the past few hours, and it was overstressed. Let's leave it at this. We've finished everything we need to do here. Albedo, let's go back. Understood. Albedo's reply sounded very tense. There should be no reason for her to be so on edge in a harmless place like the village. In that case, there was only one reason he could think of for Albedo to be like this. Ains quietly asked Albedo, "Do you hate humans?" "I detest them. Humans are weak and inferior life forms. They would look so pretty if I squashed them like bugs, besides that girl." Albedo's words were as sweet as honey, yet their meaning was terribly cruel. Ains felt that they did not fit Albedo's benign, goddess-like beauty. Therefore he said, "I see. I understand how you feel. However, I hope you can control yourself for the time being, because we have to put on a show." Albedo nodded energetically. As Ains looked at her, he began to feel frustrated. Her likes or dislikes would not be a problem for now, but the future was a different matter. Understanding his subordinates was an important skill he had to master. After Ains realized this, he began looking for the village chief. It was basic manners to bid someone farewell before leaving. He found the chief almost immediately, talking to some of the villagers. He had a stern look on his face, but it did not seem normal. Indeed, he seemed to be quite wound up. What was happening now? Ains resisted the urge to go Che, and approached the chief. After all, he had saved them once, that meant that they were his responsibility. What's wrong, Chief Dono? The chief's face lit up, as though he had glimpsed a golden shiny wire of hope. Oh, Ains-sama. It would seem there are some mounted people who look to be warriors approaching us. I see. The chief and the other nearby citizens looked at Ains, worried expressions on their faces. Ains gently raised his hand as he saw this, which filled everyone with relief as he said, "Leave it to me. Gather all of the survivors into the village chief's house right now. The chief and I will remain here." A bell rang, and the villagers gathered. The Death Knight took up a position near the chief's house, while Albedo remained behind him, awaiting orders. In order to dispel the chief's unease, Ains cheerfully said, "Please be at ease. I will make an exception and handle this for free." The chief no longer trembled, and smiled bitterly instead. Perhaps he had prepared himself to take this risk. After a while, they finally sighted many mounted warriors along the road leading to the village. The horsemen slowly entered the square. They aren't uniformly equipped, and each of them is outfitted differently. Are they not regular troops? Ains mused as he observed the men and their war gear. The knights from before had breastplates bearing the sigils of the Baharuth Empire, and they were heavily equipped, each in the same way. While these men were wearing armor as well, their gear varied from man to man. Some wore leather armor and some did not have their plate armor on, exposing the chainmail underneath. Some of them wore helmets, while some went bareheaded. About the only thing they had in common was that they each showed their faces. All of them had swords of similar make, but apart from that, they also carried bows, javelins, maces, and other backup weapons. One could say that they looked like hardened veterans of the battlefield. A less polite way would be to say that they were a ragtag bunch of sellswords. The riders finally entered the square. There were around 20 of them, and while they were wary of the Death Knight, they formed up neatly before Ains and the village chief. A man stepped forward from the rest of the force. He seemed to be the leader of the horsemen. He looked like the fiercest and most eye-catching one of his men. The leader's eyes rested briefly upon the village chief, before lingering on the Death Knight, and then he turned toward Albedo. He took a long time looking at her. However, once he satisfied himself that none of them were going to move, he immediately turned his keen gaze on Ains. Although the man looking at him seemed to be the sort who made his living by violence, Ains remained still. A look like that could not hope to raise any ripples on the still lake of Ains' heart. It was not because Ains did not fear those eyes, but because of his undead body. Perhaps he was full of confidence because he could use his powers from Yggdrasil. Once satisfied, the leader spoke in a grave tone. "I am the warrior captain of the Riestai's kingdom, Gazef Stronov. By order of the king, I have been visiting each of the frontier villages to exterminate knights from enemy countries who have been making trouble here." His even baritone echoed through the village square, and there was some commotion from the chief's house behind Ains. The kingdom's warrior captain. Won't anyone tell me what's going on? Ains thought as he spoke to the chief, his voice carrying a hint of rebuke. What sort of man is he? According to the traders, he was a man who claimed the championship of the martial arts tournament held before the king, and now he leads the elite warriors who are loyal to the king. Is the man before us truly so amazing? I do not know. All I heard were stories. Ains looked closely, and he saw that each of the horsemen had the same emblems on their chests, which resembled what the chief had said about the kingdom's emblems. That said, he did not have enough reliable information to be sure. Gazef looked at the chief and said, "You must be the chief of this village. Can you tell me who is the person beside you?" Ains interrupted the chief, who was about to answer, before nodding to Gazef and introducing himself. There is no need for that. Pleased to meet you, warrior Captain Dono of the kingdom. My name is Ains Olgaun, and I am a magic caster. This village was attacked by knights, and so I stepped in to rescue them. Gazef immediately dismounted, his armor clattering loudly as he did. He bowed deeply once he was on the ground. Thank you for saving this village. I have no words that can adequately praise your kindness. The air seemed to tremble. The warrior captain was a man from a privileged class of society. It was quite shocking that such a man would bow and scrape before a nobody like Ains, in this world where people were so clearly divided amongst each other. From what he had heard, the concept of human rights was almost non-existent in this country, no, in this world. A few years ago, the kingdom still sanctioned the slave trade. One could tell Gazef's character from the way he was ready to dismount and bow to Ains despite their difference in status. This man is definitely the kingdom's warrior captain, Ains concluded. Please, do not stand on ceremony. In truth, I did this for payment, so no thanks is needed. Oh, a payment.